They sold her like an object, in broad daylight, in front of the whole town, and no one said a word. Elena Ashcroft was thrust onto the auction platform empty-handed, all her possessions stolen by her greedy stepmother. Laughter erupted from the crowd, until the most dangerous man on the frontier entered the square. He didn't bid. He paid, and took her away. No one understood why. But the answer will change everything. Like and comment on the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. The morning they sold Elena Ashcroft, the sky above Red Hollow was the color of old iron. Not quite gray, not quite blue, just that particular shade of nothing that the frontier wore when something bad was about to happen, and the land already knew it. She'd been awake since before dawn. Not from nerves, though the nerves were there, coiled tight beneath her ribs where she couldn't reach them. She'd been awake because the room they'd put her in, the back storeroom of Mabel Dunning's boarding house, the kind of room that smelled of mildew and someone else's old boots, had a gap in the wall where the wind came through, and the wind had been making a sound like a woman trying not to cry. Elena hadn't slept. She'd sat on the edge of a cot that was really just a board with a blanket thrown over it, and she'd watched the gap in the wall, and she'd thought about her father. Thomas Ashcroft had died 6 weeks ago. Fever, the doc said, though the doc in Red Hollow was also the town's part-time barber and full-time drunk, so his word on medical matters carried roughly the same weight as his word on everything else. Thomas had been strong his whole life, the kind of man who could sink fence posts in rocky ground without breaking a sweat, who'd built the Ashcroft Ranch from 160 acres of nothing into something that mattered. He'd been strong right up until he wasn't, and then he'd gone fast, the way strong men sometimes do, like they can't bear to do it slowly. He'd been dead 3 weeks before Elena learned the truth about what he'd left behind, or rather, what he hadn't. "There's nothing left in your name," Vera Ashcroft had told her, standing in the kitchen of the house Elena had grown up in, her voice carrying that particular brand of calm that only truly cruel people can manage when they're delivering destruction. "Your father updated his papers 2 months before he passed. Everything goes to me. The ranch, the land, the water rights, all of it." Elena had looked at her stepmother's face, the sharp cheekbones, the pale eyes that had never quite warmed to anything, not even in the years when she'd pretended. And she'd known, somewhere below conscious thought, that this wasn't right. Her father had never said a word about changing anything. He'd told her directly, sitting on the porch the summer before, watching the sun go down over their land. "This will all be yours someday, Ellie. Every stick and stone of it." But the papers existed. She'd seen them. Or she'd seen papers that looked like them, with signatures that looked like his. And in Red Hollow, in the year of our frontier's complicated and frequently unjust legal arrangements, what you could show was what you owned, and what you owned was who you were. Vera had given her 4 days to gather what she could carry. What Elena had been able to carry turned out to be very little. Now she sat in Mabel Dunning's storeroom and listened to the wind come through the wall, and she thought about the ranch, the smell of it in the morning, cattle and sage, and the particular sweetness of the creek that cut through the east pasture, and she thought about how a person could lose everything in 6 weeks without doing a single thing wrong. The door opened without a knock. "Time," said the man Vera had hired. He was big and blank-faced, the kind of man who didn't need an expression because he had size instead. He'd been the one who'd collected Elena from the ranch and brought her here, and he'd done it with the same energy someone might use when moving furniture. Efficient, impersonal, completely indifferent to the fact that he was handling a human being. Elena stood. She didn't have much choice, but sat. Red Hollow's main square wasn't much to look at on its best day. A wide patch of packed dirt with a trading post on one side, a saloon on the other, and various establishments of varying legitimacy filling in the gaps. There was a platform near the center, originally built for public announcements and the occasional political address, that served other purposes when the town's other needs arose. Today it was draped with a banner Elena didn't look at directly. There were more people than she'd expected. That was the thing that hit her first when they walked her out. The crowd. Maybe 40 people, maybe more, clustered in rough clusters. Men mostly, though there were some women at the edges, watching. Ranch hands and cattle buyers and storekeepers, and a few men whose particular breed of rough she couldn't immediately classify. Some of them she recognized from years of coming into town with her father. A few of them had shaken Thomas Ashcroft's hand at his funeral. None of them looked away when she was brought to the platform. Vera stood off to the side, dressed in something that cost more than most of these people made in a month. She didn't look at Elena either. She was talking to a man Elena vaguely recognized as Dolph Harker, one of the larger cattle operators in the territory. A thick-necked man with small eyes and an air of perpetual impatience, like the world kept moving slower than he wanted. The man who seemed to be running things, a wiry fellow named Cass, who Elena had seen around town without ever learning much about, climbed up beside her and addressed the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd done something like this before. "All right, folks, we're here for a simple matter of transaction. Miss Elena Ashcroft, as some of you know, finds herself in an unfortunate situation. The late Thomas Ashcroft's estate, fully settled per lawful documentation, leaves this young woman without property or means. Rather than become a burden to the county, an arrangement has been made. Starting bid is $20, someone called from the back, before Cass had even finished his sentence, and a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Elena felt the sound like something physical, like being pushed without being touched. She kept her face still. She'd made a decision somewhere in the long hours of the sleepless night. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Not here. Not in front of people who had known her father, who were standing here watching this happen and not doing one single thing about it. Her hands were shaking. She tucked them against her sides where nobody could see. 25, came another voice with the tone of someone bidding on livestock. 30? 35? She looks healthy enough. The way they said it, healthy, made her stomach turn. Cass was doing his auctioneer routine, filling the silences between bids with patter, keeping the energy up, treating the whole thing like a sale of grain or equipment. The bids came in scattered and without much enthusiasm. There were men in the crowd who weren't bidding but watching, the way people watch something uncomfortable that they don't want to have been part of, but also don't want to miss. 50, said Dolph Harker, from the side where he'd been standing with Vera, and his voice had a different quality than the others, flatter, more certain, like he wasn't bidding so much as informing the crowd of what was going to happen. A few of the other bidders pulled back. Harker's reputation had weight in this territory, and not the kind of weight that invited challenge from strangers. Elena looked at the ground, not because she was ashamed, she wasn't, not for any choice she'd made, but because she couldn't look at the people watching her without the shaking moving from her hands to her face, and she wasn't going to let that happen. 55, said a voice from the back of the square. Elena looked up without meaning to. He was standing at the far edge of the crowd, and he hadn't been there a minute ago. She was nearly certain of it. Or maybe he had been, and she just hadn't noticed, which felt strange because he wasn't the kind of man who went unnoticed. He was tall, not in the theatrical way of men who use their height, but just genuinely tall, the kind that meant he could see over most of the crowd without trying. Lean but not thin, the way a person gets when they've spent years doing actual physical work and never had occasion to stop. His coat was dark, worn at the edges without being ragged. He had a hat that had seen better decades, and under it a face that was not handsome exactly, but the kind of face you looked at twice. Hard planes and angles, a jaw that was set in what appeared to be its permanent expression, and eyes that were, she couldn't quite tell the color from this distance, but they were focused. She could feel that, focused on Cass and the platform, and on her, with an attention that was different from what everyone else was giving her. He wasn't looking at her like a buyer. She didn't know what he was looking at her like. She just knew it was different. Dolph Harker turned. He looked at the man at the edge of the crowd the way he'd looked at the other bidders, dismissive, confident. And then something shifted in his face, not fear exactly, but recognition, and with recognition, recalculation. 60, Harker said. 70, said the man in the dark coat. He said it without moving, without raising his voice. The word just arrived in the square like it belonged there. Someone near Elena murmured something to someone else. She caught the shape of a name without catching the name itself, and then the person next to that person repeated it, and the word moved through the crowd like something dropped in water, rippling outward. Harker's jaw tightened. 80. A pause. Not a hesitant one, a deliberate one, the kind of pause that has a point. 100, said the man in the dark coat. The square went quiet in a way that felt different from regular quiet. It was the quiet of a lot of people deciding simultaneously not to speak. Harker's small eyes moved from the man to Vera and back. Vera gave him a look that Elena couldn't read from the platform. Some kind of calculation passing between them, some weighing of variables. Whatever Harker saw in Vera's expression, it resulted in him turning back to the square and saying nothing. Cass waited. His auctioneer's patter had dried up somewhere in the last few exchanges, and he stood on the platform doing a passable impression of a man who was simply administering a process and not thinking very hard about what it was. 100, Cass said finally. Going once? Going twice? He looked around the crowd, and nobody said anything. Sold. The man in the dark coat moved through the crowd toward the platform, and the crowd moved out of his way, not in a theatrical parting of waters kind of way, more like how water naturally flows around a rock, without drama, just physics. He reached the platform and paid what was owed without ceremony or comment, folding the bills in a way that was neither deliberate nor careless. He didn't say anything to Elena. He just looked at her. Those eyes, up close, were a specific shade of gray-green, like the color of sage after rain. And then he looked at the crowd and then back at her. "You want to get out of here?" he said. His voice, up close, was the same as it had been from across the square. Even, unhurried, without particular inflection. Elena looked at the platform, at Cass, at Vera standing to the side with an expression that was already moving on to other calculations. She looked at Dolph Harker, who was watching the man in the dark coat with something complicated going on behind his small eyes. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He stepped back from the platform so she could climb down. He didn't offer his hand, which she noted, and she wasn't sure whether she was grateful for that or not. And when she was on the ground, he turned and walked back toward the edge of the square. She followed him. There was nothing else to do. His horse was tied at the far post, a big buckskin, plain-colored, no nonsense. He untied it without a word and started walking, leading the horse, and Elena walked beside him, and they got 3 streets away from the square before she said anything. "I need to know what you expect from this." He kept walking. "Don't expect anything." "That's not an answer. You paid $100 for—" She stopped herself. "For this. For me. There's always something someone wants in exchange for $100. He stopped. Not dramatically. Just stopped. The way a person does when they've decided to engage with something directly rather than keep moving. He looked at her, and she made herself look back, even though there was something in the steadiness of his attention that made it difficult. "I expect you to be honest with me," he said. "That's what I told you. That's what I meant. And if I am honest, what then? Then we figure out the rest." She studied his face, looking for the part he wasn't saying. There was always a part people weren't saying, but his face was doing what it apparently always did. Just sitting there, neither inviting trust nor refusing it, just present. "I don't know your name," she said. "Rhett Calloway." The name hit her somewhere between recognition and something harder to name. She'd heard it. She'd heard it more than once in the way people say certain names, with a particular care, a lowering of the voice, as though the name itself required handling. "I've heard of you," she said. "Most people have. They say you've killed men." A pause. Not evasion, more like he was deciding how exactly to be accurate. "Some. When there was reason to." Elena looked at him. She looked at the town square behind them, where she could still hear the crowd beginning to disperse, the specific sound of 40 people deciding to go back to their regular day after watching something happen. She thought about the room in Mabel Dunning's boarding house. She thought about Vera's face, that calm that was really just barely concealed hunger. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended. No dignity to it, no frame of bravery, just the fact. "I know," he said. "That bothers you?" "No," he said. "Come on." He started walking again. She walked with him. The Calloway Ranch was 17 miles out of Red Hollow, which meant they didn't arrive until after dark. Rhett rode, and Elena rode behind him. A practical arrangement he'd offered without fuss, and she'd accepted with the same energy, because impracticality wasn't something she could afford right now. She'd never ridden with someone behind her before, or in front of someone, like this. The horse was big enough that it wasn't uncomfortable, and Rhett rode without the kinds of small, unnecessary movements that some men made. He was just there, solid, not trying to take up more space than he needed, which she noted without knowing quite what to do with the noting. They didn't talk much during the ride. She asked him once how long he'd had the ranch, and he said 12 years, and she asked if he had hands working for him, and he said 2, and that was more or less the extent of it. The dark came in the way it did on the frontier, completely, without apology, the sky going from dusky purple to full dark in what felt like minutes, the stars arriving all at once. She could smell the ranch before she could see it, cattle and hay, and the particular mineral smell of well water. When they rode in through the gate, a plain gate, no decoration, just functional timber, there was a light in the main house window and another in the bunkhouse further back. A man appeared from the direction of the barn, late middle age, weathered in the all-over way that outdoor men get, with a face that would have been ordinary if he hadn't had the kind of eyes that suggested he'd seen enough of the world to have opinions about it. Rhett. He looked at Elena with no particular expression. And company. This is Elena Ashcroft, Rhett said. She'll be staying. The man, Pete, she'd learn his name within the hour, nodded with the ease of someone who'd learned not to ask questions about things that would be explained eventually. I'll get the spare room set up. Appreciate it. Elena climbed down from the horse with somewhat less grace than she'd have liked. Her legs were tired and the ground was further down than she'd judged, and stood in the yard while Rhett handed the buckskin off to Pete's younger colleague, a boy of about 19 who introduced himself as Dex and seemed simultaneously very young and very capable. Rhett walked toward the house, and Elena followed, and he held the door for her without making a ceremony of it. The inside of the house was not what she'd expected. She'd expected it to be spare, which it was. She hadn't expected it to be clean. There was a large table in the main room, scarred from use but scrubbed, a fireplace that was functional rather than decorative, with a few things on the mantel, a folded cloth, a tin cup, something she couldn't identify from here. The floors were rough wood but swept. The shelves held tools and supplies, organized in a way that suggested they had a system. There was one thing that surprised her, which was the books. A row of them on the lowest shelf, spines facing out, different sizes. A collection that didn't have the look of display but of actual use, spines cracked, some of them with paper tucked inside as markers. "You read," she said, without really thinking. He was at the stove, which still had some warmth in it from earlier. He didn't look at her. "Some." "What do you read?" He didn't answer for a moment, fiddling with the stove's iron handle. "History mostly, some of it dry, some of it not." Elena looked at the books. She thought about her father's study, the small bookshelf he'd kept, the way he'd sometimes read aloud to her in the evenings before the ranch work swallowed his energy entirely. She thought about how many things could be lost. "I can cook," she said. "If that's useful." He looked at her then. That direct attention again. "I'm not keeping accounts," he said. "You're not working off a debt." "I know that. I'm saying I can cook because it's true, and it seems like a practical thing to establish." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but something that acknowledged the logic. "Then yes," he said, "cooking is useful." The first week was the hardest. Not because of Rhett. He was difficult to read, but not difficult to live alongside. He had a routine and he stuck to it. Up before sunrise, coffee made, out to the cattle before the heat built up, back in the early afternoon, back out if there was fence work, in at dark. He didn't explain much. He didn't ask much. He moved through his days with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped wasting energy on things that didn't matter, which could have felt cold but mostly just felt like honesty. The hard part was Elena herself. It was the adjustment, the way she kept waking up and for about half a second not knowing where she was, and then knowing and having to run through it all again. Her father was dead. The ranch was gone. She was here, in a stranger's house, in a situation that didn't have clean edges or clear exits. She was 23 years old, and she had never been without a home before, had never been without the specific gravity of a place that was hers. And she hadn't understood until now how much of a person's sense of themselves was tied up in simply having somewhere to be. She cooked, she swept, she found the vegetable garden behind the house, neglected but not dead, and spent 2 mornings clearing it out. She fixed a broken hinge on the cellar door that had apparently been broken for months, based on the way Pete looked at it when she was done. Like it had been a minor irritant so long he'd stopped noticing it. Rhett watched all of this without comment. On the 5th day, he came in from the morning cattle work earlier than usual and found her in the kitchen wrestling with a sack of flour that had developed a knot in its ties. "Here," he said, and she stepped aside and he undid the knot in about 10 seconds. "I had it," she said. "I know you did." He set the flour on the table. "I wanted to ask you something." She waited. "This ranch your father had, the Ashcroft land. What do you know about how your stepmother got the papers transferred?" Elena looked at him. "I know she says he updated his will 2 months before he died. I know the documents she showed me looked right. His handwriting, his signature, the right notary stamps, but what? My father told me the summer before he died that the ranch would be mine. He didn't say someday like it was far off. He said it the way a person says something that's already been decided, like he'd already arranged it, like there was nothing left to arrange." She paused. "He wasn't forgetful. He wasn't the kind of man who said one thing and then did another without telling anyone." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "What notary stamped the papers?" The name on the stamp was a man called Burrell, Gerald Burrell. Rhett's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or something close to it. "You know him?" Elena asked. "I know of him," Rhett said. "He's the notary Dolph Harker uses for his land business." Elena was still for a moment. "Harker," she said. "He was bidding today." "He was? And he's connected to my stepmother." "That's what I'd like to find out." She looked at him, really looked at him, the same way she'd been wanting to since the square, trying to find the angle, the thing he was getting out of this, the reason a man who didn't need to get involved had gotten involved. "Why does it matter to you," she said, "what my stepmother did? Why is it your problem?" Rhett was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I knew your father." She didn't know what she'd expected him to say, but it wasn't that. "Not well," he continued. "He sold me 2 horses, 4 years back. Fair price, no nonsense. We talked. He was a man who did what he said and said what he was going to do." A pause. "That's rarer than it sounds." Elena sat down. She sat down because her legs decided to do it before she'd made any conscious choice. "He never mentioned you," she said. "He had no reason to." Rhett looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I'm not trying to make this into something it isn't. I saw what was happening in that square, and I knew who those men were, and I thought somebody ought to do something about it. That's all." "That's all," she repeated. "I'm not a complicated man." Elena looked at him. She thought, no, you might actually be exactly the opposite of that, and you might not know it. But she didn't say it. "If you're right about the documents," she said, "if Vera forged them with Harker's notary, what do we do about it?" Rhett didn't answer immediately. He looked at the kitchen around them. The flour on the table, the morning light coming through the small window over the basin, the familiar disorder of a functional space. Then he looked back at her. "We find proof," he said, "and then we figure out how to use it." Well, she found the ranch's rhythm in the 2nd week, once she'd stopped fighting it. It helped that the work was real work, not the kind of work that was invented to keep someone occupied, but the kind that actually needed doing. The garden required daily attention if it was going to produce anything before the season turned. The house needed maintenance that it hadn't been getting. There were meals to cook for 3 men and herself, which was not complicated but required organization. Dex, the young hand, turned out to be unexpectedly useful company. He talked more than Rhett and Pete combined, not in an annoying way, but in the way of someone who was genuinely curious about things, and hadn't yet learned to manage his curiosity into smaller, more socially acceptable quantities. He was from somewhere in Ohio originally, he told her, which she could have guessed from the particular way he looked at the landscape, with an appreciation tinged with a kind of low-level awe, the way people from the East looked at the frontier when they hadn't yet gotten used to the scale of it. "You doing all right?" he asked her on the 8th day, while she was at the garden and he was fixing a section of fence nearby. "Well enough," she said. "It's a strange situation," he offered, not as a judgment, just as an observation. "Yes," she agreed. "It is. Rhett's all right, though." He said it like she might need to know. People get the wrong idea about him because of how he carries himself and because of things that happened before. But he's fair. He's always been fair." Elena pulled a weed that had gotten deep roots and had to put some effort into it. "What things happened before?" Dex paused on his fence work. "Before my time, mostly. But from what Pete says, there was a period, years back, when Rhett worked for people he shouldn't have worked for. Enforcement-like. The kind that's not law enforcement." He hesitated. "He got out of it. Bought this place. Pete says it cost him something to get out, and it cost him something to stay straight after, but he did it." Elena thought about this. "Does he talk about it?" "Not to me. Maybe to Pete. Maybe to nobody." She looked over at the house, at the plain face of it. Functional, unpretentious, the kind of structure that said I was built to last rather than I was built to impress. "He knew my father," she said. "He mentioned that. Said Thomas Ashcroft was a straight dealer." Elena turned back to the garden. She dug her fingers into the soil and felt the realness of it, the specific temperature of dirt that had been warmed by a week of good sun, the texture of it, the smell. Her father had always said that if you wanted to know whether land was worth something, you put your hands in the dirt and felt it. Good dirt told you. This was good dirt. The discovery happened on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary kind of day for something that turned out to matter enormously. Rhett had ridden into Red Hollow for supplies, and he'd come back with supplies and with something else. A folded paper that he set on the table in front of Elena without preamble. "What is this?" she asked. "Copy of the original deed filing for your father's ranch. The one from when he registered the land before he had it re-registered after your mother died." He sat down across from her. "Look at the signature." She looked. Her father's handwriting. She would have known it in her sleep, had known it all her life, the particular slightly angular quality of the capital letters, the way his F looped. She'd know it anywhere. "Now look at this." He put another paper beside it. The deed Vera had filed, the one with the updated ownership papers. Elena looked at both signatures. She looked for a long time. "The F," she said finally. "Yes." "His F doesn't loop like that. His loops differently, tighter. This one goes the wrong way." "I know," Rhett said. "I noticed it when I was looking at a receipt he gave me for the horses. I kept it. Don't know why, I keep things. And I dug it out. The signature on Vera's deed is wrong." Elena was still looking at the two pieces of paper. She was thinking about Vera standing in the kitchen, that smooth certainty she'd had, the absolute confidence of someone who'd planned something carefully enough to not worry about being caught. She was thinking about how she'd felt, standing there, with the papers in front of her and no way to argue against them. "It's not just the F," she said. She was looking closer now. "The pressure is different. He pressed hard when he wrote. You can see it in his letters. The lines are heavy. This," she touched the forged signature gently, "this is lighter. Someone who was copying didn't know to press hard." Rhett nodded. He'd seen the same things. "It's not enough on its own." "No," she agreed, "but it's a start. If Burrell is willing to admit he stamped a document he didn't witness properly, or if we can find someone else who was involved in the filing, then a judge might look at it differently." Elena looked up from the papers. "The sheriff won't help. He and Harker, I know. We'd need to go over his head. District judge comes through twice a year. Next time is 8 weeks. 8 weeks, she repeated. I can find out more in that time. There are people in Red Hollow who know things and don't much like Harker. Not enough to say so publicly, but enough to say so quietly to someone they trust more. She looked at him. And they trust you? Some of them. Elena folded both papers carefully and set them side by side on the table. She looked at them. She thought about 8 weeks. She thought about what 8 weeks meant. 8 more weeks of Vera in the house her father had built, sitting at the table he'd sat at, looking out at the land he'd worked. I'm not waiting and doing nothing, she said. I know. I want to be part of finding the proof. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her it was too dangerous or too complicated or that she should leave it to him. He just said, all right, which was one of the many things about him that she was beginning to recognize as distinctly his own. Then let's start from the beginning, she said. Tell me everything you know about Dolph Harker. Rhett pulled his chair in. He folded his hands on the table, and he started talking. Outside, the wind had shifted. It was coming from the south now, warmer than the morning's air, carrying with it the smell of the open range, grass and dust and distance, the specific scent of a land that had no particular interest in any individual human's troubles, but was there regardless, vast and old and unimpressed. In the kitchen, with the 2 documents side by side on the table between them, Elena Ashcroft and Rhett Calloway began the slow and careful work of building a case. She didn't know, that afternoon, how hard the next weeks would be. She didn't know what Vera and Harker were planning, or how much of the town was already in their pocket, or how the confrontation that was coming would nearly break both of them before it was finished. She knew the land had been stolen. She knew the signature was wrong. She knew that the most feared cowboy on the frontier had bought her from an auction for $100 and had so far asked for nothing except honesty. And she knew, the way she knew the quality of soil by feeling it, that those 2 things together were going to have to be enough to start with. The information came out slowly, the way truth usually did when it had been deliberately buried, not in one clean revelation, but in layers, each one requiring work to get to. Rhett talked, and Elena listened, and by the time the lamp burned low that first evening, she had a picture in her head that was both clear and worse than what she'd started with. Dolph Harker had come to the territory 11 years ago with money from somewhere back east that nobody had ever fully accounted for. He'd started with cattle, a modest operation, legitimate enough on its surface, and then expanded. Not through better ranching, through acquisition. He had a particular talent for identifying land that was either in dispute or about to be, and inserting himself into those disputes in ways that reliably ended with his name on the deed. He'd done it 6 times that Rhett knew of. The previous owners had either sold under pressure, lost in court through what looked like legal means but felt like something else, or simply, in 2 cases that Rhett mentioned with a particular quietness, moved away suddenly without much explanation. The sheriff, a man named Collis Pratt, had been in Harker's pocket for at least 3 years. Not because Pratt was especially corrupt by nature, Rhett thought, more because Harker had found the specific pressure point that worked on him, which appeared to involve a debt and possibly a threat. And Pratt had made his calculation and kept making it. What about the judge? Elena had asked. Harker doesn't own Judge Pemberton, Rhett said. But Pemberton only comes through twice a year, and Harker knows how to make things look clean enough by the time any official review happens. Elena had asked about Vera, specifically how long Vera and Harker had been connected, because this was the piece she kept turning over. Her father had met Vera 3 years after Elena's mother died. He'd been lonely, which was a condition that had made him, in this one area and perhaps only this one area, less careful than he normally was. Rhett didn't know the specifics of how long. What he knew was that Gerald Burrell, Harker's notary, had stamped documents on 3 of the previous acquisitions. Same pattern. Original owner dies or leaves. Updated paperwork appears with Burrell's stamp. Legal title transfers faster than it should be able to. He's done this before, Elena said. This exact thing. A version of it, yes. And nobody's stopped him. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Nobody's had what you have. The signature difference. And someone who's still alive and standing in the territory and willing to say something about it. She'd looked at him then. The others weren't. No, he said. They weren't. That was the conversation that started everything. And in the weeks that followed, it was the conversation she came back to because it clarified something she'd been feeling without being able to name. This was not just about getting her land back. This was about a pattern that had been running for years. And the reason it had kept running was because everyone who might have interrupted it had either been removed or had calculated, reasonably enough, that the cost of interrupting it was higher than they could pay. She was already at zero. There was nothing left to calculate. Rhett began making trips into Red Hollow that were longer than the supply runs warranted. He didn't explain every one of them, but he told her enough. He was talking to people, quietly, without pressure, in the way that a man who'd lived in a territory for 12 years and hadn't made enemies of everyone could manage. He was looking for anyone who'd had direct knowledge of the document transfer, anyone who'd been in Burrell's office, anyone who'd witnessed the papers being filed, anyone who'd heard Vera or Harker say something specific and remembered it. It was slow. Most people who knew something were not interested in saying so. Elena understood. She'd seen what happened to people who stood between Harker and what he wanted. Understanding it didn't make the slowness easier to sit with. She channeled it into the ranch work, which had the advantage of being immediately responsive in a way that the investigation was not. You weeded the garden got cleaner. You fixed the fence held. You cooked a meal, people ate. The directness of it was something she needed. It was during those weeks that she began actually learning the land around the Calloway Ranch. Not just as a place she was temporarily occupying, but as a piece of geography with its own character. She started going out in the mornings before cooking, just to walk the perimeter, getting a feel for the terrain. The east side dropped toward a dry creek bed that ran water for maybe 2 months of the year. The west had good grass that the cattle preferred. The northern pasture had a spring that ran year-round, small but reliable. One morning she came back from the northern pasture and found Rhett at the corral gate, watching her come in. "You're mapping it," he said. "Is that a problem?" "No." He held the gate for her. "You're looking at it the way your father looked at land." She stopped. "You watched my father look at land?" "I watched him look at the horses before he sold them to me." Same thing, I imagine. Like he was reading it. Elena thought about this. He used to say you could tell everything worth knowing about a piece of land if you walked it twice, once fast, to get the shape of it, and once slow, to see what the shape was hiding. Rhett nodded, just slightly, the way he nodded when something confirmed rather than surprised him. "Sounds right," he said. They stood at the corral for a moment, not quite looking at each other, both looking at the land. "I want to go to the land office," she said, "to look at what was filed, not just the copy you found. I want to see the original record. Pratt's deputy runs the land office. I know, but records are records. If there's a public record, I have the right to see it." Rhett looked at her. "It'll be noticed." "I know that too." Another moment, then, "I'll take you Friday." The Red Hollow Land Office was a small building adjacent to the sheriff's. A proximity that was probably not accidental, Elena thought, as they hitched the horses and walked to the entrance. The deputy who managed the records was a young man named Haas, who looked like he hadn't been in the job long enough to have gotten entirely comfortable with what it sometimes required of him. He straightened when they came in. "Miss," he said. And then, with a different quality, "Calloway." "Haas." Rhett's voice was the same as it always was, even, without edge. But it was also, she couldn't quite put her finger on it, present in a particular way, like the word itself filled up the room more than one word should. "What can I do for you?" Haas asked. "Land records," Elena said. "The Ashcroft parcel, the original filing and the updated deed submitted 6 weeks ago." Haas's eyes went to Rhett and back to her. Those records are a matter of public filing." "Yes," Elena said. "That's why I'm asking to see them." There was a pause in which Haas was clearly doing some internal calculation, what Pratt would want, what he was actually authorized to refuse, what refusing would look like next to what complying would look like. It wasn't a fast calculation. "Give me a minute," he said finally, and went to the back. Rhett stood at the counter with his hands folded. Elena stood next to him, close enough that she could feel the stillness he projected. It wasn't calm exactly, more like controlled density, like a rope pulled tight. "He's going to tell Pratt," she said quietly. "Yes," Rhett said, equally quiet. You knew he would. Yes. Then why? Because the records are public. And because when Pratt comes asking why we were here, the answer is because we had the legal right to be. That matters. Start on solid ground. Elena thought about this. She was still thinking about it when Haas came back with the folders. She looked at them carefully, methodically. Original deed first, her father's signature, the one she knew, heavy pressed letters with the F that looped the right way. Date of original filing, 22 years ago when Thomas had first registered the land. Then the chain of events, additions, the re-registration after her mother passed, a water rights amendment 7 years ago. Then the new deed, Vera's deed. She looked at it for a long time, longer than she needed to because she wanted to be certain about what she was seeing. The signature was wrong. She'd known it from the copy, but seeing the original confirmed it with a certainty that felt like something settling into place. More importantly, the date on Burrell's notary stamp. Rhett, she said. He looked. The notarization date, she said. It's a Tuesday. He looked at the stamp. Looked at her. Gerald Burrell has an arrangement with a doctor in Mill Haven, she said. He goes every other Tuesday for his gout. He's been doing it for years. I remember my father mentioning it once because Burrell was supposed to witness something for him and couldn't because of the appointment. She tapped the date on the stamp. This Tuesday is the second Tuesday of September. Rhett's eyes moved back to the stamp. He wasn't here. He can't have been. If he keeps his arrangement, he was 40 miles away in Mill Haven when this stamp was supposedly applied. They looked at each other. That's not just a wrong signature, she said. That's a notary stamp applied by someone other than the notary, or applied by the notary before or after the document existed and backdated. Either way, Rhett said, the deed is fraudulent on its face, if someone can confirm Burrell was in Mill Haven that day. Haas was watching them from across the counter with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. Elena closed the folder carefully. She handed it back to Haas. Thank you, she said. Outside, in the flat light of a Tuesday afternoon in Red Hollow, not the same Tuesday, but still, she stood on the boardwalk and felt something she hadn't felt in 6 weeks. Not relief, not victory. Something more like footing, like the ground under her feet was actually there. Mill Haven is how far? She asked. Day's ride. Can you find out whether the doctor there kept any kind of schedule? I know a man in Mill Haven, Rhett said. I can write. Write today, she said. He looked at her. That gray-green attention, focused and level. Today, he agreed. Yet, the response took 10 days. 10 days in which Elena cooked and gardened and mapped the land and tried not to think about Vera and the house her father built. 10 days in which Rhett made 2 more trips into Red Hollow and came back quieter than he'd left, which she'd learned meant he'd found something, not that things were going badly. He told her at the end of the second trip that he'd spoken to a woman named May Coulter, who ran the dry goods store and had done business with Thomas Ashcroft for 15 years. May had been present as a customer in Burrell's office for unrelated business, when Vera had come in with papers 2 days after Thomas's funeral. May said Burrell wasn't there, Rhett told her. She'd gone in because she thought he was there and found only his assistant, a boy named Finch. Vera came in while May was waiting, had a brief conversation with Finch, and left with papers that already had a stamp on them. Elena was very still. The assistant applied the stamp. Or the stamp was applied before and the document was filled in later. Either way, May was there. She saw it. Will she say so? Rhett's jaw moved slightly. She'll say so to me in private. Whether she'll say so to a judge is a different question. She's afraid of Harker. May has a store and a son and 15 years of business to protect. Fear is reasonable. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then we need more than May, she said. We need enough that the risk of staying quiet becomes higher than the risk of speaking. Rhett looked at her. That's a harder thing to build. I know, she said, but it's the thing that needs building. The letter from Mill Haven arrived on a Wednesday. It was from Rhett's contact there, a man named Aldous, who appeared from the letter's tone to be an old friend, or at least someone who'd done significant mutual favors over the years. The letter was short and direct. The doctor in Millhaven, a physician named Crane, kept a written appointment register as a matter of professional habit. He'd confirmed to Aldous that Gerald Burrell had been present in his office on the second Tuesday of September and had remained for most of the afternoon due to complications with his treatment. Rhett read the letter at the table. Then he set it down and looked at it. "Is that enough?" Elena asked. "It's enough to show the notarization is fraudulent," he said. "What we need now is someone who'll stand in front of a judge and say so. Burrell himself. Ideally." Elena thought about this. If Burrell knows we have the appointment record, and he knows we can place him in Millhaven on the day of the stamp, he might cooperate in exchange for not being prosecuted himself, Rhett said, or he might panic and run to Harker. "Which is it?" "I don't know. I've never talked to him directly." "Then we need to know which kind of man he is before we approach him?" She paused. "Pete might know, or someone Pete knows. Burrell's been in this county a long time." Rhett looked at her. There was something in his face she was starting to learn to read. A very slight adjustment in the set of his features that meant he was revising an estimate. "You think that way fast," he said. "I had a father who thought that way. I watched him do it. It's a good way to think." She looked down at the letter from Millhaven. "Do you think we can build enough to take to the judge? In 8 weeks? 5 weeks now." "I think we have a chance." He said it plainly, without inflation. "I think it's not a sure thing, and anyone who told you it was would be lying." "I know it's not a sure thing." She paused. "I just needed to hear that someone else thought there was a chance." Rhett folded the letter and set it with the other papers they'd been accumulating. The copy of the signature comparison, the land records, the notes from his conversations in town. There was a small stack of them now. Not enough, but more than there'd been. "Pete knows a man who's done business with Burrell," he said. "I'll ask tonight." Pete, it turned out, did know something. He'd never said so without being asked, because Pete operated on the principle that information was most useful when it was relevant, and until now the subject of Gerald Burrell had never come up. But when Rhett asked, over the evening meal, Pete set down his fork and said, without much preamble, "Burrell's got a brother in Forsyth County, runs a feed operation. Gerald sends money home regular. Dex can tell you, he's from that way." Dex looked up. "Yeah, I've heard the Burrell name. Gerald's brother is, he's all right. Square dealer. He'd be embarrassed if Gerald got held up as a fraud." "Embarrassed enough to influence Gerald?" Elena asked. Dex thought about it. "Maybe. The family has a reputation they care about." Rhett looked at Elena. Elena looked at Rhett. "It's not leverage," she said. "It's a factor." "It's a reason for Burrell to cooperate rather than fight," Rhett said. "If he thinks his family's reputation goes down with him, and he thinks the alternative is cooperation that we could frame as limited involvement, clerical error." "Is that true? Could it be framed that way?" "I don't know what a judge would decide, but we're not the ones making promises." Elena pushed her food around her plate. She was thinking about Vera's face in the kitchen that day, that implacable certainty. She was thinking about the auction, the crowd, the bids called out like she was something measured by the pound. She was thinking about how much she'd lost, and about the fact that loss was not an ending unless you decided it was. "I want to talk to Burrell myself," she said. The table was quiet for a moment. "That's a bad idea," Pete said, not unkindly. "Probably," Elena agreed. "But he should have to look at me." He stamped a document, or let someone stamp it, that sold a dead man's land out from under his daughter. He should have to sit across from that daughter and know what he did. She paused. "And I think if he's looking at me instead of just looking at a legal problem, he might decide differently." Another silence. Rhett said, "We'd go together." "Of course," she said. He nodded once. That was that. Outside, the night had come in the way it did on the frontier side. Completely. The stars thrown across the sky in quantities that never stopped being slightly startling, even after weeks of it. Elena stood on the porch for a few minutes before going in, looking at the dark shape of the land, the faint silhouette of the distant hills. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he'd stand on the porch of the Ashcroft Ranch in the evenings, looking out at what he'd built. He hadn't been a man who talked much about what things meant to him. He showed it instead in the quality of his attention, in the way he put his hands on the fence posts and fence posts held. She missed him with a sharpness that still surprised her sometimes. Grief was like that. It didn't keep a schedule. She heard the door behind her and knew, without looking, that it was Rhett. She'd learned the sound of his footsteps, which was the kind of thing you learned when you lived in close quarters with someone and paid attention. He didn't say anything. He stood at the edge of the porch, not beside her but near enough, and looked at the same dark landscape. "Thank you," she said after a while. "For all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd have found another way," he said. "Maybe. Not as fast." "Fast matters in this territory," he said. "Harker moves fast when he thinks something might unravel." She turned to look at him. "You think he knows we're looking?" "I think Haas told Pratt about the land office visit, and Pratt told Harker. Yes." He turned to look at her too, and in the dark, with only the starlight, his face was harder to read than usual. "We have time, but probably not as much as we'd like." Elena thought about that. She thought about 5 weeks to the judge. She thought about Vera and Harker and the forged deed and the notary stamp applied 40 miles from where the notary actually was. She thought about May Coulter in her dry goods store, who'd seen what she'd seen and was afraid. "Then we move," she said. "We go to Burrell this week." Rhett looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention she'd been trying to categorize for weeks. It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't cold either. It was the attention of someone who took what they were looking at seriously, like she was a thing worth the full weight of his consideration. "This week," he said. She nodded and went inside, leaving him on the porch with the stars and the dark land and whatever he was thinking, which she still, after more than 2 weeks, could not fully read. He was the most self-contained person she'd ever met. Not closed exactly, but with a specific economy of expression that meant you had to watch him carefully to understand anything, and even then you were probably only getting part of it. She understood, lying in the spare room that she'd gradually made feel slightly less like a spare room, that she trusted him. Not completely. She wasn't sure she'd ever trust anyone completely again after what Vera had managed, but enough. Enough to work with. Enough to go to Burrell with, and to mean it when she said together. That was not nothing. On the frontier, in this particular stretch of bad luck and complicated alliances, it was actually quite a lot. Gerald Burrell's office was on the quieter end of Red Hollow's main street, past the saloon, past the trading post, in a narrow building wedged between a harness maker and an empty lot that had been waiting to become something for as long as anyone could remember. The sign above the door said G. Burrell, Notary and Document Services in letters that had been repainted recently, which Elena noted because it seemed like a strange thing to spend money on when everything else about the building suggested a man of modest means and modest ambitions. They'd ridden in early, before the street traffic built up. Rhett's idea. Fewer eyes on the horses, fewer people to mention to Pratt that they'd seen Calloway and the Ashcroft woman heading into Burrell's building. Elena had agreed without argument. She was learning to pick which hills to stand on, and the timing of their arrival wasn't one of them. Burrell himself opened the door when they knocked. He was smaller than she'd imagined. She'd built a version of him in her head over the past 2 weeks, the man who'd stamped a document that stole her father's land, and that version had some size to it, some presence that matched the scale of what he'd done. The actual Gerald Burrell was maybe 5'7", with thinning hair he'd arranged carefully over the top of his head, a slight stoop at the shoulders, and eyes that were doing something complicated the moment he recognized Rhett. "Calloway," he said. His voice was even, but his hand on the doorframe wasn't. "Morning, Gerald." Rhett's voice had that particular quality it got when he was being deliberate about its evenness. "This is Elena Ashcroft, Thomas Ashcroft's daughter." Burrell looked at her. She looked back. She'd decided on the ride-in that she wouldn't look away first, and she didn't. Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the expression of a man who'd been waiting for a knock on a specific door and had almost convinced himself it wasn't coming. "You'd better come in," he said. "What? The office was cluttered in the way of a man who dealt in paper and had never quite solved the organizational problem that created. Stacks of folders on the desk, a filing cabinet with one drawer that didn't close all the way, an inkwell that had left rings on the desk surface over years of use. There were 2 chairs facing the desk, and Burrell went behind it, which Elena understood. He was putting the furniture between himself and the conversation. She sat. Rhett stood near the door, not blocking it, just present. "Mr. Burrell," Elena said, "I want to ask you directly about the deed transfer on the Ashcroft parcel, the one filed 6 weeks ago." Burrell was arranging things on his desk that didn't need arranging. "That was a lawful document, properly filed. Your stamp was applied on the 2nd Tuesday of September," Elena said. "I have a written confirmation from Dr. Crane in Millhaven that you were in his office that entire afternoon. I also have a witness who was in your office that day and saw your assistant Finch speaking with Vera Ashcroft." The desk arranging stopped. Burrell sat very still. Outside the building, someone was moving a wagon down the street, the wheels loud on the packed dirt, and then that sound faded and the office was quiet. "What do you want?" he said. His voice had dropped. "I want to know how it happened," Elena said. "Start there." He looked at her. He looked at Rhett. He looked at his desk. "Finch didn't know," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The boy had no idea what he was doing. She came in with the documents already prepared and told him I'd authorized the stamp in advance, that it was a routine matter, and I'd forgotten to mention it to him before I left." He paused. "He's 20 years old. He believed her." "And you?" Elena said. Another pause. Longer. "She came to me a week before your father died." He said it like he was reading from something, flat and careful. "She had documents already drawn. She said Thomas had asked her to have them prepared, that he wanted to update things before his condition got worse. She had a letter with his signature authorizing the changes." He stopped. "That letter," Elena said. "Did you examine the signature?" "I looked at it." His voice was getting quieter. "I thought it looked like his signature. I'd witnessed his signature before, years ago, on the original deed. I thought it looked right." "It didn't look right," Elena said. "His F loops differently. The pressure is wrong." "I know that now." The words came out rough, like they'd been sitting in his throat too long. "I didn't catch it then. Or I wasn't looking as hard as I should have been. She paid me well to process it quickly and without questions, and I—" He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth briefly. "I knew it was fast. I knew it was faster than it should have been. I told myself the letter covered it." "But you were in Millhaven," Elena said, "on the day the stamp was applied, so your stamp went on a document you never witnessed." "Yes." The word just sat there in the office. "Harker," Rhett said from near the door. He said it quietly, but it landed like a stone in a pond. "Was he part of the arrangement?" Burrell looked at Rhett with the expression of a man who'd spent weeks trying not to think about a specific thing. "He facilitated the payment. He was present when Vera came to me the first time." A pause. "He told me it was a family matter being handled appropriately. He told me I'd be doing everyone a service by moving quickly." "And if you didn't?" Rhett said. Burrell's shoulders went in. Not dramatically, just slightly, the particular collapse of a man who'd been carrying something heavy and was finally letting the weight be seen. "He mentioned my brother," he said. "He mentioned the feed operation in Forsyth County. He said it would be a shame if certain unpaid debts my brother owed came to the attention of the wrong people." The room was very quiet for a moment. Elena looked at Gerald Burrell, this small, stooped man who'd spent his career dealing in the weight of paper and signatures and official stamps, who'd made one calculation too many and ended up here, across the desk from the dead man's daughter. She didn't feel sorry for him. She also didn't feel the satisfaction she'd thought she might. He was just a man who'd been weak at the wrong moment, which was a more ordinary kind of failure than she'd wanted him to have. "Here's what I'm asking," she said. "I'm asking you to tell a judge what you just told me. The letter, the timeline, Harker's involvement, the fact that your stamp went on that document without you present." Burrell's eyes moved to Rhett. "And if I do?" "You weren't the one who forged the signature," Elena said. You were pressured and you moved too fast and you made a mistake. That's different from being the architect of it. She kept her voice level. I can't promise what a judge decides. But the difference between cooperating and not cooperating is the difference between a clerical failure under duress and deliberate fraud. You know which one is easier to live with. Burrell looked at his desk. He looked at his hands. He was quiet for long enough that Elena started to feel the weight of the silence. The possibility that he'd calculate differently, that the fear of Harker would outweigh everything else, that they'd leave this office with nothing new. My brother, he said finally. If this comes out, if I testify, Harker will go after him. Harker is going to have other problems, Rhett said. If this comes in front of a judge, he won't have a lot of reach left from a prison cell. You're sure about that? No, Rhett said, which surprised Elena slightly. She'd expected something more reassuring. But I'm sure that the alternative is it never comes in front of a judge at all, and Harker keeps doing what he's been doing, and your name is on a fraudulent deed that the next person might not be as charitable about as Miss Ashcroft. Burrell looked at Rhett for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena. I'll need time, he said, to arrange things, to write to my brother before it becomes public. You have until Friday, Elena said. She hadn't planned to say that specifically. It came from some instinct about how much time was enough and how much was too much. I need to know by Friday whether you'll stand in front of a judge and say what you said to us today. Burrell closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and said, Friday. They left him sitting behind his desk with the unfiled papers and the inkwell rings and the weight of what was coming. No. Outside, the street had gotten busier. Elena walked to the horses without looking around, which took some effort because the back of her neck was prickling with the awareness that they were visible, that being in Red Hollow at all was a kind of exposure. He'll do it, she said, when they were at the horses and she could speak quietly. Maybe, Rhett said. You don't think so? I think he wants to. I think he's afraid of what happens if he doesn't. And I think he's afraid of what happens if he does. And I don't know which fear is bigger. He untied the buckskin. We'll know Friday. Elena untied her horse. She'd been riding a gray mare of Rhett's that had a forgiving temperament and didn't seem to mind her still developing horsemanship. What do we do until Friday? There's something else I need to tell you, he said. He said it in a way that meant it wasn't something small. She looked at him. Harker is moving up the livestock auction, Rhett said. It was scheduled for the 1st of next month. He's moved it to next Thursday. Elena was still. That's before the judge arrives. Yes. Why would he move it? But she was already working out the answer as she asked. He's going to use the auction. It's a public event, the biggest public gathering in this part of the territory. He's going to use it to do something that locks in the transfer before we can get to the judge. That's what I think, Rhett said. I think he knows we've been asking questions. I think he wants to make the Ashcroft land deal look so official and so publicly settled that any challenge afterward looks like sour grapes from a bitter woman with no standing. What could he do at the auction? Present the deed as security for a public cattle deal. Get witnesses, legitimate buyers, legitimate sellers, to see the Ashcroft land cited as collateral in a transaction. Makes it harder to unwind. Not impossible, but harder. Elena stood with her hand on the horse's neck and thought. The auction was Thursday. Burrell would give his answer Friday. Judge Pemberton wasn't due for 3 more weeks. The numbers didn't work in their favor. We need to get to the auction, she said. Rhett looked at her. Not to stop the deal quietly, she said. If we stop it quietly, Harker just finds another way. We need to be there, in public, with what we have. The signature comparison, the Millhaven confirmation, all of it. And we need to put it in front of everyone who's attending. That's 100 people, Rhett said. Maybe more. Buyers from 4 counties. I know. Pratt will be there. Harker will be there. If we walk in with documents challenging a deed Harker is presenting, I know what will happen, Elena said. I'm not saying it goes smoothly. I'm saying it's the only option that doesn't let him lock this in before we can get legal review. Rhett was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that full-weight attention. If it goes wrong, then it goes wrong in public, in front of 100 witnesses, and whatever happens to us is witnessed too. She kept her voice steady. He can't make us disappear quietly if there are 100 people watching. Rhett's jaw moved slightly. Not quite an expression, more like an acknowledgement that she was right, and he didn't entirely enjoy that. We'll need Burrell's answer before Thursday, he said. Not Friday. Thursday morning before the auction starts. Can we move the deadline? I'll go back this afternoon. They looked at each other. The street moved around them. A woman with a basket, two men in conversation, a dog crossing from shade to shade. There's one more thing, Elena said. May Coulter. She needs to know what we're planning. If she's willing to stand in that crowd and confirm what she saw in Burrell's office, it adds weight to everything. May is afraid. I know, but she was also friends with my father for 15 years. Elena paused. Let me talk to her. Rhett considered. She's at the store now, probably. Then I'll go now. He handed her the gray's reins. I'll find you in an hour. May Coulter's dry goods store was narrow and deep, organized with the thoroughness of someone who'd been running the same space for a long time and knew where everything was by memory. May herself was behind the counter when Elena came in. A solid woman in her 50s with the kind of face that had stopped being pretty some years ago and had become something better instead, more permanent. She looked at Elena without surprise. Either she'd expected this visit or she'd heard they were in town, or both. Elena Ashcroft, she said. Her voice was careful. Mrs. Coulter. Elena came to the counter. I think you know why I'm here. May began straightening a row of thread spools that didn't need straightening. I've heard you've been asking questions. I have, and I think you have an answer to some of them. May's hand stilled on the thread. What I have, she said slowly, is a store, and a son who's starting a business, and 15 years of relationships in this territory that keep me in a position to survive. I know, Elena said. Harker has run 3 people out of this territory that I know of personally. One of them was a woman who ran a boarding house and made the mistake of saying something she shouldn't have, and she lost everything. I know that too, Elena said. She put both hands on the counter. Mrs. Coulter. May. You knew my father. May looked at her. He told me once that you were the most honest trader he'd ever done business with, that you never shorted a scale and never walked back on a price, and never let a man leave your store feeling like he'd been taken advantage of. Elena paused. He said that like it was the highest compliment he knew how to pay. May's expression shifted slightly. Not softened exactly, tightened, like something being compressed, like a woman holding herself together. Thomas was a good man, she said. Yes, and Harker and my stepmother forged his signature and stole his land 6 weeks after he died. Elena's voice stayed even. It cost her something to keep it that way. I'm not asking you to do something with no risk attached. I'm telling you that we have enough. The signature proof, Burrell's testimony, the Millhaven record, and we're going to the auction on Thursday, and we're going to put it in front of everyone there. What I'm asking is whether you'll be in that crowd. Not to speak necessarily, just to be there. And if a judge later asks whether anyone witnessed the fraudulent deed being challenged publicly, to say yes, you were there, and you saw what you saw in Burrell's office. May looked at her for a long time. The thread spools sat neatly in their row. Through the store window, the street moved through its ordinary Thursday business. You're going to get hurt, May said, walking into that auction. Maybe. Harker doesn't respond well to being publicly challenged. Pratt will be there. I know. And you're going anyway. I don't have another option that works, Elena said. If I had a better one, I'd take it. May looked at her for another long moment. Then she looked at the counter, at her own hands. She seemed to be measuring something internal against something else internal. My son's business, she said. He's working in Harker's cattle territory, geographically, I mean. If Harker goes after people. If Harker ends up in front of a judge for fraud, Elena said quietly, he's going to have considerably less reach. That's an if. Yes. Elena didn't try to make it sound otherwise. It is. Another silence. Then May said, Thursday. Thursday. I'll be in the crowd. She held up one finger. I'm not standing up front and announcing anything, But if I'm asked later by a proper legal authority what I saw in Burrell's office, yes, I'll say it. Elena breathed out. It was not a dramatic breath, just a slow release, the kind that happens when you've been holding something and didn't realize it. Thank you, she said. May nodded, once, briskly, in the way of a woman who'd made a decision and didn't need to have a conversation about it. Your father would have done the same for anyone who needed it, she said. That's all. Rhett found her outside the store 40 minutes later. He'd been to Burrell's. She could tell from his expression, which was doing its version of careful neutrality that meant the result had not been entirely clean. He'll give his statement, Rhett said, Thursday morning before the auction. He wants to write it down and sign it, give a copy to us, and keep a copy himself. That's better than we asked for, Elena said. He also told Harker we'd been in to see him. She stopped. When? Within an hour of us leaving. Haas from the land office told Pratt, and Pratt told Harker we were at Burrell's, and Harker went to see Burrell himself. Rhett's voice was steady, but the steadiness was doing work. Burrell told him we'd asked routine questions about the filing process, and he told us nothing useful. He lied to Harker to protect us, Elena said. Or he's managing both sides until he figures out which one is safer. Rhett's voice wasn't unkind, just precise. Either way, Harker knows we've been active. He'll expect something at the auction. Then he'll have his people ready, Elena said. Yes. She thought about this. She thought about Thursday, 3 days away, and about walking into the territory's largest public livestock gathering with a stack of documents and the intent to interrupt whatever Harker was planning. She thought about the auction square in Red Hollow 6 weeks ago when she'd been the one standing on a platform with everyone watching. The memory had a specific physical quality to it still, the way the crowd's attention had felt like pressure, like being underwater. She thought, this time, she'd be choosing to stand up in front of the crowd. That was a different thing. Not less frightening, different. We need Pete and Dex, she said, at the auction, not for trouble, just present. Already planning to have them there, Rhett said. And we need to be clean, she said. Every document we bring. The originals, or the most legitimate copies we can make. Dated, signed, organized. If someone in that crowd is going to believe us over Harker, they need to be able to see the evidence, not just hear us describe it. I can get a second copy of the Millhaven letter notarized in Forsyth County before Thursday. Different notary, different county. Harder to dismiss. Do it tomorrow, she said. Take Dex for the ride. He looked at her. You're running this now, he said. It wasn't a complaint. It was an observation. And there was something in the way he said it that was close to, she didn't know the right word. Respect wasn't quite right. Recognition, maybe. Someone has to, she said. Yes, he agreed. They stood for a moment on the street in Red Hollow, with the auction square visible at the far end and the sheriff's office visible closer in, and Harker's presence detectable in the town the way certain weather was detectable before it arrived. In the quality of the air, in the way people moved. 3 days, Elena said. 3 days, Rhett said. She looked at the auction square. She looked at the platform that was still there, still at the center, the same boards she'd stood on 6 weeks ago when the town had watched her be sold. She was going to stand in front of a crowd again on Thursday. This time she was going to be the one talking. She was not certain it would be enough. She was not certain how Harker would respond, or whether the crowd would listen, or whether having the truth on her side would turn out to matter the way it was supposed to. What she was certain of was this. She was not walking away. She had tried zero, and she had tried patience, and she had tried the slow work of building evidence in private, and now it was time for the thing that was left. She had her father's signature and a dead man's honesty, and 100 witnesses who were about to become, whether they wanted to or not, part of the story of what had been stolen and by whom. That would have to be enough, because it was all she had, and she had never in her life had the option of waiting for more. Thursday came in cold, not the kind of cold that stayed. It was early October and the days still had warmth in them by mid-morning, but the kind that arrived before dawn and sat on the land with an intention, frost on the grass that crunched under boots and breath that showed in the air. Elena was up before anyone else, which meant she was up very early because Rhett didn't sleep much, and Pete had spent so many years starting before sunrise that his body had stopped giving him the option. She stood on the porch in the dark and listened to the Callaway Ranch settle into its morning sounds. Cattle moving in the north pasture, a horse shifting in the barn, the particular silence of land that is awake without being loud about it. She'd come to know these sounds. She'd come to know the way the cold felt specifically here, the way the light came specifically here, the quality of the dark before it lifted. She thought about the Ashcroft Ranch, whether the mornings there sounded the same, whether Vera stood on that porch, or whether she was the kind of woman who stayed inside until the world was already warm. She thought, today. Burrell was waiting at the edge of town when they arrived, which was earlier than the auction would start, but later than Rhett had specified, which meant Burrell had spent at least 20 minutes deciding whether to be there at all. He was on foot, which meant he'd walked from his office rather than ride, which meant he hadn't wanted to be seen preparing to leave. Small calculations. The calculations of a man who was frightened and doing something anyway, which Elena could respect even when she didn't trust it entirely. He had an envelope. He held it out to Rhett without preamble. "My written statement," he said. "Everything I told you, dated and signed. I kept a copy." Rhett took it. He didn't open it, just felt the weight of it, which seemed sufficient for whatever he was assessing, and put it inside his coat. "You're staying for the auction?" Elena asked. Burrell looked at the main square, which they could see from here. The beginning of the crowd gathering, the stock pens beyond the square already audible with cattle, the particular organized chaos of a large territorial auction assembling itself. "I'll be nearby," he said, which was not the same as yes, but was not no either. "If Harker tries to present that deed as security for any transaction," Elena said, "I'm going to challenge it publicly. If a judge later convenes a hearing, your statement will be submitted, but it carries more weight if you're there." Burrell looked at her. He looked at Rhett. He looked at the square again. "I'll be there," he said, and walked away before she could thank him or say anything else, which was probably intentional. The territorial livestock auction was the kind of event that reminded Elena why the frontier, for all its difficulties, had a scale to it that other places didn't. By 9 in the morning, there were close to 150 people in and around the Red Hollow Square. Cattle buyers from as far as 3 counties, sellers who'd trailed herds in over 2 days, merchants who'd set up alongside the square to catch the traffic, families who'd come because it was the largest gathering of the season and there was always something worth seeing. She and Rhett moved through the edge of the crowd separately, which they'd discussed. Being seen together too early would signal their intent before they were ready. Pete had positioned himself near the cattle pens, where his rancher's presence was entirely unremarkable. Dex was on the north side of the square near the hitching posts, similarly inconspicuous. Elena stayed near May Coulter's store, which was positioned on the eastern end and gave a clear line of sight to the auction platform. May had opened for business as usual. It would have been stranger if she hadn't, and was visible through the window, moving between customers, doing what she always did. She caught Elena's eye once, through the glass. A brief meeting of gazes. Then May turned back to her customer. Harker arrived at 9:30, with 2 men Elena didn't recognize, and Sheriff Pratt walking a deliberate half-step behind him, which made the relationship between them visible in a way that a more careful man might have thought to obscure. Harker was in good clothes. Not dressed up exactly, but the clothes of a man who'd made a decision that morning about how he wanted to look. Confident, settled, already certain of how the day went. Vera came separately, 20 minutes later, and took a position near the eastern side of the platform. She was dressed well, as she always was, and she had about her the specific self-possession of someone who believed they'd already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Elena watched her from across the square and felt something that wasn't quite anger. It was more clarified than anger, more cold. She'd felt it building since the morning in the kitchen, that day Vera had stood there with her careful voice and her stolen papers, and it had been building through 6 weeks of loss and adjustment and slow, careful work. And now it had refined itself into something that wasn't hot at all. It was the temperature of certainty. Rhett appeared at her elbow from nowhere, which she'd stopped being startled by. "He's going to present the Ashcroft land in the 3rd lot," Rhett said quietly. "I overheard 2 of his men talking. He's using it as collateral to back a large purchase. Makes the deal look like it's already part of a settled estate. Third lot, Elena said. How long? 20 minutes from the auction start. Maybe a bit more. The auction master, a heavy-set man named Cord, who had the kind of carrying voice that suggested he'd been doing this all his life, climbed the platform and brought proceedings to order with a practiced ease. The crowd settled into its listening configuration, buyers near the front, sellers and observers fanning out behind. Elena worked her way forward through the crowd during the first lot. Not to the front, she didn't want to be visible yet, but close enough. She had the documents inside her coat. The signature comparison. The Millhaven letter with its Forsyth County notarization, a summary she'd written herself of the timeline and discrepancies, and Burrell's sealed statement. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was not comfortable. The first lot went through without incident. A herd of Hereford cattle, legitimate transaction, Cord's voice bouncing off the storefronts. The second lot. Elena watched Harker move toward the platform during the break between second and third, saying something to Cord that made Cord nod. She looked for Rhett and found him. He'd moved to the left side of the platform, 8 or 10 feet away, where he stood with his particular quality of occupying space without announcing it. He caught her eye. A small nod. She looked for Pete and found him at the edge of the crowd, watching. Dex further back, also watching. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he'd looked at that porch that summer, talking about the land like it was already hers. She thought about the auction square and $100, and a man in a dark coat who'd asked nothing except honesty. Cord called for the third lot. Harker stepped up. He was a practiced public presence. Elena could see that immediately. He didn't bluster or over-explain. He spoke with the confident brevity of a man who expected his authority to do most of the talking for him, and in this territory, with these people, it usually had. I'm presenting the Ashcroft parcel as collateral on the purchase of the Danner herd, he said, with Cord facilitating beside him. Deed transfer is settled, documentation complete, and this secures a transaction between my operation and... That deed is fraudulent. Her voice came out louder than she'd intended, or exactly as loud as the situation required. She wasn't sure which. It crossed the square and hit the platform, and Harker's voice stopped mid-sentence. The crowd turned. 150 people, or close to it, turned toward the sound. Elena was already moving forward. The deed transfer on the Ashcroft parcel was executed with a forged signature and a notary stamp applied in the absence of the notary. It is not a legal document. Any transaction secured against it is not a legal transaction. Harker looked at her. He had the face of a man processing multiple things simultaneously. The surprise of her appearance, the audience, the problem of how to respond. He chose confidence, which was probably the only tool he had that worked in public. This is Thomas Ashcroft's daughter, he said, to the crowd more than to her, who, as some of you know, has made some unfortunate claims about her late father's estate, claims that have been looked at and found to be without merit. By who? Elena said. She was at the edge of the platform now. By Sheriff Pratt, who stood 3 feet behind you since you arrived this morning. That's not an independent review. That's a man doing what you tell him. A murmur moved through the crowd. Not agreement necessarily, more like attention sharpening, the way a crowd shifts when something real is happening. Pratt moved. She saw him from the corner of her eye, moving toward her from the left side, hand on his belt. Rhett moved from the other side, not toward Pratt, but into the space between them, which accomplished the same thing differently. Pratt stopped. The crowd noticed that too. I have documentation, Elena said, raising her voice to Carrie. She pulled the papers from inside her coat. I have the original deed on the Ashcroft parcel and the fraudulent transfer side by side. The signatures are different, measurably, visibly different. I have a written and notarized confirmation from a physician in Millhaven that Gerald Burrell was in his office all afternoon on the day this deed was supposedly stamped. I have a witness who was present in Burrell's office when Vera Ashcroft came in with documents that already carried his stamp. The murmur in the crowd had changed quality. It was louder now, more directional, people talking to the people beside them, the information spreading in the way things spread through a gathered crowd. She's making serious claims, Cord said from beside Harker. He looked uncertain. He was an auction master, not a judge, and whatever he'd expected from the third lot, it hadn't been this. Mr. Harker, is there a response? This is a disruption, Harker said. His voice had hardened. The deed is legal. The documentation has been reviewed. By who? Elena said again. Name a judge who's reviewed it. Name anyone with legal authority who has reviewed these papers and found them legitimate. She held the documents out toward the crowd, not toward Harker, toward the people watching. Look at these. Anyone who wants to look at them can look at them. The signature on the fraudulent deed is lighter, differently formed, and the notary who supposedly stamped it was 40 miles away. This is not an unfortunate claim. This is fraud, and it's fraud that Dolph Harker orchestrated. Harker's two men were moving now. She saw them from the corner of her eye, moving toward the platform from the crowd. The kind of movement that had a purpose to it. One of them got close to Pete before he got close to Elena, and Pete, who was 60 years old and looked like he'd been made from fence posts and weathered timber, put a hand on the man's chest and stopped him with a firmness that was not theatrical but was very effective. The other one got closer. Dex appeared from somewhere behind and grabbed the man's arm, and there was a moment of struggling that the crowd near them could see clearly, and the struggling made the crowd pull back and open up, which meant more people could see it, which meant more people were now watching two of Harker's men being physically restrained from approaching a woman with documents. That was not a good look. Even people who'd been inclined to dismiss Elena's claims could see that. Harker saw it too. He made a decision. She could see the decision being made in his face, the calculation running, and then the expression that followed it was a controlled version of fury. He stepped down from the platform, shipum setum palquam, which removed him from the elevated position that had been giving him authority, but getting away from the situation was apparently worth that. He crossed to Pratt. What he said to Pratt, she couldn't hear. What Pratt did in response was move toward her. Miss Ashcroft. Pratt's voice was doing its official register, flat and certain, the voice of a man using a title that was still technically valid. You're disrupting a lawful public event. You'll need to come with me. On what charge? She said. Her voice was steady. She was not going to let it shake in front of 150 people. Disturbing the peace. I'm speaking at a public gathering about a matter of public record. She turned back to the crowd because the crowd was the point. This man wants to take me away from here before you all have a chance to look at these documents. Ask yourself why. The crowd was fully engaged now. Not hostile, just watching, the way crowds watched when the thing in front of them had become genuinely interesting. Some of them had moved closer. Some of them, ranchers, cattle buyers, people who had their own relationships with land documentation, were looking at the papers she was holding out with an attention that was no longer passive. A man near the front said, "Let her show the papers." It wasn't said loudly, but it was said clearly enough that the people around him heard it, and some of them turned to look at the man who'd said it, and a few of them nodded. Pratt's hand moved toward Elena's arm. The shot didn't come from anywhere close. It came from the far side of the square, from the alley beside the harness makers, and it went into the ground 10 feet from the platform, kicking up a spray of dirt. It was meant to scatter the crowd. It worked, partially. People near the shot's impact moved back fast, the instinctive recoil of people near sudden violence. But it didn't scatter the whole crowd. It scattered the edges and left the center, and the center of the crowd had been watching, and what they'd seen was Harker's man standing in the alley where the shot had come from, and what they understood, even before they could have put it into words, was that this was not a random disturbance. Rhett had moved the moment before the shot. She didn't know how he'd known to, whether he'd seen something or heard something, or just read the situation with the particular experience of a man who'd spent years in environments where violence was a possibility and had learned to feel it before it arrived. He was between her and the alley when the shot hit the ground, and he stayed there. He didn't draw. He just stood there, which in its way was its own kind of statement. A man who wasn't running, not toward the threat and not away from it, just standing, making himself the thing between whatever was coming and the woman behind him. Pratt had stopped. He'd stopped when the shot fired, the way that officials stopped when a situation exceeded their prepared responses. In the silence that followed, a silence that was only a few seconds long but had the texture of something much longer, Elena did the thing she'd decided to do before she left the ranch that morning. She walked to Cord. He was still on the platform, visibly shaken, looking at the crowd and at Harker and at Pratt with the expression of a man who wanted this to be someone else's problem. She put the documents on the auctioneer's platform in front of him. All of them. The signature comparison, the Millhaven letter, the timeline summary, and Burrell's sealed statement. "These are for you," she said to Cord, quietly enough that it wasn't a speech, just a direct address, one person to another. "You're the auctioneer. You have witnesses here from 4 counties. You have documents that show this deed is fraudulent. I'm asking you, in front of every person in this square, to hold the 3rd lot until a proper legal review can be conducted." Cord looked at the documents. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Harker, who was saying something to one of his men on the far side of the square. He was a man who ran auctions, not a man who made legal determinations, but he was also a man with a reputation to protect, and the reputation of a territorial auctioneer depended on one thing above all others: the transactions he facilitated being legitimate. "Third lot is tabled," he said, in the carrying voice that had announced 100 transactions. The crowd heard it. What followed was not a resolution. Elena had known it wouldn't be. Resolution required a judge and proper proceedings and the specific weight of legal authority, none of which were present in the Red Hollow Square on a cold Thursday morning. What happened instead was messier and in some ways more significant. Harker left the square. He left without another word from the platform, moving through the crowd with his men around him. Not the confident exit of someone who'd prevailed, but the rapid exit of someone who was recalculating. Pratt trailed him, which told the watching crowd something. Vera, who'd been on the east side throughout, was gone before Elena even noticed her leaving. The crowd took a while to disperse, and while it did, Elena stood near the auctioneer's platform and people came to her, not in a tide, 1 or 2 at a time, cautiously, with the particular approach of people who wanted to know more without wanting to be seen wanting to know more. A rancher named Wick, who'd driven cattle in from the northern valley, asked to see the signature comparison. She showed him. He looked at it for a long time, a man who'd signed enough documents in his life to have opinions about signatures, and handed it back without saying anything, but with an expression that said something. A woman whose husband had bought land from Harker's operation 2 years ago asked about the Millhaven letter. Elena showed her that too. The woman asked what a proper legal review would look like and when Judge Pemberton was expected, and Elena told her 3 weeks, and the woman wrote something down on a piece of paper she produced from her coat and put it in her pocket. 2 men Elena didn't know, buyers from their appearance, from outside the territory, talked to each other for a few minutes, and then came to ask whether the Ashcroft parcel had been cited as security for any previous transactions they might have been party to. She didn't know the answer to that, she told them. They said they'd be in contact with their attorneys before finalizing any deals with Harker's operation. Red appeared beside her after 20 minutes of this and said quietly, "Burrell is here." She looked. Burrell was at the edge of the dispersing crowd, standing near the harness maker's building, watching. He hadn't spoken publicly. He hadn't shown himself during the confrontation. But he was here, which was what she'd asked for, and the sealed statement was in Cord's hands, which was what mattered. "The shot," she said. "Harker's man." "Pratt's going to call it an accident," Rhett said. "Firearm discharge in a crowd, unintentional, that's how he'll write it if he writes it at all." "Can we—" 4 people near the alley saw who fired. I talked to 2 of them. He paused. "They'll talk to a judge." Elena looked at the square, at the dispersing crowd, at Cord on his platform packing up the documents she'd left with him, at the cattle in the pens beyond, who'd been completely indifferent to all human drama throughout the morning. "Harker's going to move," she said. "He's going to try to do something before Pemberton arrives." "Yes." Rhett's voice was careful. "He can't undo what happened here. Too many people saw it. But he can try to get to Burrell before the hearing. Get him to recant. Get him to leave the territory." "Can we protect Burrell?" "For 3 weeks?" Rhett thought about it. If Burrell is willing to stay somewhere other than his office, somewhere Harker's people aren't going to know to look. "Would he come to your ranch?" A pause. "I'll ask him." Elena looked at the platform. She thought about what had happened here, how it had and hadn't gone the way she'd planned, how the shot had changed the shape of it, how the crowd had responded in ways she couldn't have predicted and couldn't have controlled. It hadn't been clean. It had nearly come apart twice, when Pratt had moved toward her and when the shot had fired. She was still running slightly warm from the adrenaline of it, the way her hands had wanted to shake, and she'd made them hold the papers steady. The way her voice had wanted to drop, and she'd made it carry. Pete appeared. His coat had a smear of dirt on the sleeve from his encounter with Harker's man, and he looked at it with mild disgust before looking at Elena. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You?" "Man had bony elbows," Pete said, which she took to mean he was fine. Dex appeared a moment later, flushed, with the expression of someone who'd been in his first real confrontation and was processing it with a mixture of alarm and something closer to satisfaction. "The man I grabbed," he said. He's fine," Rhett said. "Let him go." "Already did." Dex looked at Elena. That was something. She almost laughed. "Yes," she said. "It was." They rode back to the Calloway Ranch in the early afternoon, when the worst of the tension had settled into something dull and exhausted. Burrell had agreed to come, reluctantly, calculating his options with the visible strain of a man who'd run out of good ones and was picking among bad ones, and was riding with Pete and Dex in a configuration that Pete had arranged without anyone asking him to, the way Pete arranged most things. Elena rode beside Rhett. The cold of the morning had lifted, but not entirely, and the sun was hitting the land at the low angle of early October, making the grass look like it was lit from inside. "It's not over," she said after a while. "No." 3 weeks to the judge. Harker will try something in 3 weeks. "Yes." She thought about what that meant. 3 weeks of keeping Burrell safe, and their documents safe, and their witnesses intact. 3 weeks of Harker knowing that what he'd built in this territory was cracking at the foundation. "The woman who wrote something down," Elena said. "The one whose husband bought land from Harker." "Margaret Ainsley." She looked at him. "You know her." "I know of her husband. He was one of the men I told you about, the previous acquisitions. They paid Harker more than the land was worth, and they always felt wrong about it." He paused. "If Ainsley's husband thinks there's a legal process coming, he might have something to add to it." "More witnesses," Elena said. "More witnesses." She looked at the road ahead, at the gate of the Calloway Ranch appearing in the middle distance. The plain, functional gate, the land beyond it spreading out in the afternoon light. She thought about what she'd done in the square that morning, standing up in front of 150 people with documents in her hands and a knot of fear in her chest that she'd refused to let into her voice. She thought about how it had felt when Cord said "third lot is tabled" in that carrying voice. Not victory, not relief. Something more like evidence. Evidence that it was possible, that the thing she'd been building toward was real and reachable, even if it wasn't reached yet. She thought about Vera leaving the square without a word, and the way Harker had walked through the crowd with his men around him. Not the walk of a man who'd won, but the walk of a man who'd been seen and knew it. "He's afraid," Elena said. Rhett looked at her. "Now he is." "He wasn't before." "No." A pause. "He is now." She felt something settle in her at that. Not satisfaction, not yet, but the first solid piece of something that might eventually become it. The auction that had been meant to seal what Vera and Harker had taken and make it permanent had instead become the moment when 150 people had stood in a square and watched a dead man's daughter hold up evidence and refuse to be moved. That couldn't be undone. Whatever happened in the 3 weeks ahead, whatever Harker tried and whatever Pratt did or didn't do about the shot that had been fired into the ground of a public gathering, that moment in the square existed, and the people who'd been there existed, and the documents she'd put in Cord's hands existed. The gate passed behind them. The Calloway Ranch spread out in the late October light. She rode in without knowing exactly what was coming next. That was honest. That was as much certainty as anyone ever really had, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise somewhere in the last 6 weeks, which was its own kind of progress. The 3 weeks that followed the auction were the longest of Elena's life, which was saying something given the 6 weeks before them. Burrell stayed at the Calloway Ranch. He slept in the spare room off the barn, not Elena's room, a smaller one that Pete had cleared out without being asked, and he spent his days in a state of suspended anxiety that expressed itself as compulsive tidiness. He organized the barn tools. He swept the porch twice a day. He cataloged the contents of the root cellar in a small notebook he'd produced from somewhere. He was a man waiting for something to happen to him, and the waiting had to go somewhere. Elena didn't particularly like him. She didn't dislike him either. He was what he was, a small man who'd made a calculation and gotten pulled under by it and was now trying to find solid ground. She understood that more than she wanted to. Harker made 2 moves in those 3 weeks that they knew about, and probably others they didn't. The first was an attempt to buy Burrell's silence through an intermediary, a man who'd appeared at the ranch road one morning claiming to be a surveyor looking to verify property boundaries, who'd asked for Burrell specifically, and who'd left when Red appeared on the porch and stood there looking at him without saying anything at all. The man had not come back. The second was more serious. 11 days after the auction, someone fired through the window of May Coulter's dry goods store after dark. No one was inside, which was either accidental or deliberate, depending on how charitable you were feeling. And Elena wasn't feeling especially charitable. The shot broke 2 glass bottles on the back shelf and left a hole in the wall that May had covered with a board by the following morning. Rhett had ridden into town the day after and talked to May for an hour. He'd come back and told Elena that May was still willing to testify, that she'd been shaken but not moved, and that she'd said, with a particular evenness that Rhett relayed with something close to admiration, that she was 61 years old and had been threatened by better men than Dolph Harker, and she wasn't about to rearrange her life to accommodate him now. Elena had felt something sharp and grateful at that, the specific gratitude for another person's courage that arrives when you understand exactly what that courage is costing them. The days were not empty. She wrote letters to Judge Pemberton's office, formally notifying him of her intent to petition for review of the deed transfer, citing the evidence she held. She helped Rhett organize the documents into an order that a legal proceeding could follow. She worked the garden and the kitchen and the land, because the land didn't pause for human difficulty, and the work of it kept her from spinning inside her own head. At night, she sometimes sat on the porch after everyone had gone in, and she let herself feel the things she'd been managing during the day. The fear that it might not work, the grief for her father that hadn't gone anywhere just because there was other urgent business, the exhaustion of being certain in public when certainty was not the full truth of what she felt. Rhett found her there one of those nights. He sat down in the other chair without being invited, which she'd stopped minding some time ago. "The Ainsley husband," she said. She'd been thinking about it. "Has he written back?" "Letter came today." Rhett had it in his coat. He'd been waiting for the right moment, which was an unusual thing for him to do. He was generally a now or not at all kind of man with information. His wife did most of the writing. He confirms he paid above market value for land adjacent to the Ashcroft parcel under pressure that he documents specifically. He'll testify. Elena looked at the dark land beyond the porch. "That's 3 witnesses," she said. "Burrell, May, Ainsley, plus the physician's record from Millhaven, plus the signature comparison, plus the people who saw Harker's man fire that shot. 2 of them have already sent written statements to my contact in Forsyth County to hold until the hearing." He paused. "It's a substantial case." She looked at him. "You think we'll win?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think a judge looking at this honestly has no reasonable choice except to rule in your favor. Whether the judge looks at it honestly is a different question." "Pemberton's reputation?" "Is good, from what I can find." He held up the Ainsley letter slightly. "In cases like this, with documented fraud, notary's admission, multiple corroborating witnesses, even judges who'd prefer to look the other way find it difficult to do so in front of this much paper." Elena thought about that. She thought about how it had felt to stand in the auction square with the documents in her hands, and how the crowd had turned, and how Cord had said tabled in that carrying voice. "He's going to run," she said. Not about Harker, about Burrell. She'd been thinking about it for days. The specific quality of Burrell's anxiety, The way he'd started asking careful questions about roads to the east. Rhett's jaw moved slightly. Possibly. If he runs before the hearing, his written statement still stands. His signature is on it. The Forsyth County notarization hold. He paused. It's better if he's there in person, but it's not nothing without him. She looked at her hands. I'll talk to him tomorrow. Elena. He said her name with a particular quality. She'd noticed that he used her name rarely, and when he did, it was because he meant to. You've built enough. Whatever Burrell decides, you've built enough. She wasn't sure she believed that, but she let herself hear it because some things needed hearing from outside yourself before they could settle anywhere. Judge Pemberton arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed to Elena like a joke the calendar was making. Tuesdays being the day Burrell was supposed to have stamped the fraudulent deed, the day he was actually 40 miles away in Mill Haven. She didn't mention this to anyone. Pemberton was older than she'd expected, 70, maybe more, with a deliberate slowness to his movements that was not frailty but precision, the way of a man who'd learned that moving carefully saved time overall. He set up his proceedings in the largest room of the Red Hollow Meeting Hall, which was also used for town gatherings and occasionally theatrical performances, and which had a stage at one end that served as a bench with only minor adjustment. Harker came with the lawyer, a man brought from the county seat, well-dressed, with the specific confidence of someone whose primary professional skill was making bad things look ordinary. He sat at the right-hand table and arranged his papers with unhurried precision and looked at Elena when she came in with Rhett, with the expression of a man assessing an obstacle. Vera was there too. She sat behind Harker's table, not at it. She wasn't a party of legal standing in the proceeding, which was its own kind of justice, small but real. She was wearing the clothes of someone who'd dressed carefully for the occasion, and her face was doing its composed thing, that specific smoothness Elena had known for 3 years. She looked at Elena once, when Elena sat down, and the look was complicated. Not the certainty she'd had in the kitchen the day she'd told Elena the land was gone. Something more mixed. Elena read it as, I'm not sure how this happened. Elena looked back until Vera looked away. Burrell had not run. He'd woken up the morning of the hearing looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days and had eaten maybe half of what Pete had put in front of him for breakfast, and he'd ridden into town in the wagon without saying much of anything, and he'd sat down in the meeting hall with his hands folded and his face the color of old paper. But he was there. May Coulter came in and sat in the 3rd row. She'd dressed in her good clothes, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had a right to be here and knew it. The Ainsley couple came in together. Margaret Ainsley had the written record her husband had compiled, 20 months of documentation about the purchase that had felt wrong, organized with the thoroughness of someone who'd been waiting for a chance to use it. The hearing ran for most of the day with Pemberton directing proceedings with a patience that never became passivity. He asked the right questions, which Elena recognized as a skill, the ability to ask the question that opens the thing that needs opening without telegraphing what you're looking for. Harker's lawyer was good. He worked at the edges of the evidence, questioning the chain of custody on the signature comparison, casting doubt on whether a physician's appointment register constituted sufficient evidence of absence, probing Burrell's credibility on the grounds of his admitted acceptance of payment for fast processing. Burrell held. Elena watched him and was surprised by it. She'd expected him to fold under cross-examination, to qualify his statements into meaninglessness. But something had happened to Burrell in the 3 weeks at the Callaway Ranch, surrounded by functional people doing functional work, and whatever it was had given him a steadiness she hadn't seen before. He answered the questions directly. He didn't elaborate more than asked. When Harker's lawyer pushed on his credibility, Burrell looked at him and said, I'm aware that I behaved badly. I'm here because I'm trying not to continue doing so. You can decide what that's worth. Pemberton had written something down at that. Elena couldn't see what. May Coulter testified about what she'd seen in Burrell's office. She was brief and specific and completely unshakable, and when Harker's lawyer suggested her memory of a detail might be imprecise, she looked at him with the expression of a woman who'd been running a store for 30 years and said, I know what I saw, and I know when I saw it. I don't generally misplace details about the days when crimes are committed in front of me.
Was?
The Ainsley testimony added a dimension Elena hadn't fully anticipated. It placed the fraudulent deed transfer within a pattern, showed the court that the Ashcroft case was not an isolated incident, but a practice, and gave Pemberton the context of years rather than weeks. Parker's lawyer objected repeatedly, and Pemberton overruled him repeatedly, with a patience that had a very definite edge underneath it. Rhett testified briefly about the transaction with Thomas Ashcroft, the horse sale, the receipt, the signature he'd kept and compared. He was exactly what he was in every situation, direct, without embellishment, precise. When he left the stand, Parker's lawyer didn't look satisfied, which was its own indicator. Elena testified last. She'd been dreading it and had decided to stop dreading it and focus on what she was actually going to say, which was the truth in the order in which it had happened, starting with her father on the porch that summer and ending with the auction square and the documents in Cord's hands. She talked about her father. She didn't plan to do it. She'd planned to stay factual, to stick to the evidence. But when Pemberton asked her to describe Thomas Ashcroft's intentions regarding the ranch as he'd communicated them to her, she found herself talking about the porch and the summer light and the way he'd set every stick and stone of it like it was already settled, because it was. Because he'd spent his whole life making things that lasted and meant to keep doing it, and then hadn't had the chance. She didn't cry. She'd made a decision about that, and she held it. But her voice did a thing in one or two places that she couldn't entirely control, and she didn't try to hide it, because hiding it would have been dishonest, and she was done being anything other than exactly what she was in front of people who were judging her. When she was done, the room was quiet for a moment. Pemberton looked at the document spread on his bench. He looked at the room. He had the face of a man who'd seen a great deal and had not become cynical about it, which was a kind of achievement Elena recognized even now. "I'll have a ruling by morning," he said. Whooped. The ruling came at 8 o'clock, before most of Red Hollow was fully awake. The fraudulent deed was voided. The Ashcroft parcel reverted to Elena as the legitimate heir under Thomas Ashcroft's original and unaltered estate. Gerald Burrell was assessed a professional penalty and barred from notarial practice in the territory, but was not criminally charged. The judge noted his cooperation and the duress he'd been under while making clear that the leniency was not a precedent. Sheriff Pratt was suspended pending a territorial review of his conduct, which everyone in the room understood to mean he would not be sheriff much longer. Parker and 2 associates were referred to the territorial prosecutor for criminal fraud charges on 3 documented cases, including the Ashcroft transfer. Parker left Red Hollow before noon on the day of the ruling. He didn't pack everything. People who left fast rarely did. And the house he'd used on the north side of town sat with its curtains drawn for 3 days before anyone went in to assess what was there. Vera left the same day. Elena heard this secondhand from Dex, who'd heard it from someone in town. She'd hired a wagon and loaded what she could carry and gone in the direction of the county seat, which was the direction of somewhere else, and that was enough. Elena didn't need to know more than that. She didn't feel victorious about Vera. She'd thought she would. She'd imagined, in the harder nights of the preceding weeks, that there would be something satisfying about watching her stepmother's situation collapse the way her own had collapsed in that kitchen. But what she actually felt was a kind of tired flatness, the emotion that comes after things are over and the body is still catching up. She felt her father's absence, sharply, specifically, in a way she knew would keep arriving at irregular intervals for years. He should have been there to see this. He should have been the one to whom the land was restored. The fact that the right thing had happened didn't undo the wrong thing that had happened first, and she'd stopped expecting it to. That was the part nobody told you about justice. That it rarely arrived in time to give you back what you'd already lost. It gave you what was left. Sometimes that was enough, and sometimes it wasn't. And the honest thing was to know the difference rather than dress up the remainder as something it wasn't. She went to the Ashcroft Ranch on a Saturday, 10 days after the ruling. She went alone, which felt right. The house was not in the condition she'd left it in. Vera hadn't been a careless tenant. She was too controlled for carelessness. But the house had the feeling of a place that had been occupied without being inhabited, the difference between a space being used and a space being cared for. Some things had been moved. A few things were missing. The kitchen had a different smell. Elena went through it room by room, not cataloging damage but just being present in each one. Her father's study, where the small bookshelf still stood. Some of the books were gone, but not all of them. The bedroom she'd grown up in, unchanged. The porch, where the boards were the same boards she'd stood on countless evenings, looking at the same land. She stood on the porch for a long time. The land was in good condition. Whatever Vera's failings, she'd hired competent people to maintain the cattle and the fences, because the land's value depended on it. The east pasture looked as it always had. The creek was running, which it usually didn't this late in the season, which felt not symbolic. She wasn't someone who trafficked much in symbols, but worth noting. She thought about her father. She thought about the specific smell of his coat, the way he'd made coffee too strong and drunk it without noticing, the way he'd talked to the cattle when he thought nobody was listening. Not affectionately, just matter-of-factly, the same way he talked to people. She thought, I will try to deserve this. Not in the sense of having earned it, because she'd been born to it, and that was not the same as earning it. In the sense of carrying it forward the way he'd carried it, honestly, practically, with attention to what it actually required rather than what looked good. Rhett came to the ranch the following week on a Tuesday, that day again, with Pete and Dex, ostensibly to help with the fence assessment she'd mentioned needing. The fence did need assessment, and they did assess it, and there was a genuine working quality to the afternoon that she valued. At the end of it, when Pete and Dex had ridden back and it was just the two of them at the porch, Rhett said, You're going to be all right here. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said, I think so. A pause. It's going to be a lot of work. It was a lot of work when your father ran it. He had help. You'll find help. He looked at the land in the way he had, the reading look, the same one she'd apparently inherited from her father. There are families in this territory with nowhere. Good workers, people who know cattle. You could offer something real. She looked at him. She'd been thinking about the same thing. The ranch is something more than her own recovery. As something that could be functional for other people too. She'd thought about it without saying it, because it felt presumptuous to plan what you didn't yet own, and then she'd owned it for 10 days and still hadn't said it. You mentioned that to me once, she said. Families with nowhere. Back at your ranch, early on. I remember. Were you thinking about something specific? He was quiet for a moment. There's a family outside of town. Husband, wife, 3 children. Lost their homestead to a water rights issue 2 years ago. The husband's a solid rancher. They've been getting by on temporary work since. What's his name? Garfield. Walt Garfield. She looked at the east pasture. The bunkhouse needs work, she said, and I'm going to need someone who knows cattle better than I do right now. Rhett nodded, just slightly. The conversation had arrived where it was going to arrive, and neither of them needed to make more of it than that. She turned to look at him. This man who'd paid $100 for her at an auction in a town square, who'd asked nothing except honesty, who'd sat across from her at a kitchen table and started the slow work of building a case while she was still figuring out which way was up. He was not easy to know. He was not warm in the ways that made warmth obvious. He was something more durable than that. Consistent, precise, present in the ways that mattered when the ways that mattered were what you needed. She didn't know exactly what they were to each other. She suspected they were still in the process of figuring that out, and she was not in any particular hurry to force it into a shape before it was ready. You'll come back, she said, to check on the fences. There's always fence to check, he said, which was the most Rhett Calloway answer he could possibly have given, and which somehow contained everything that needed to be said. He rode out as the sun was dropping behind the western hills, and she watched him go from the porch, that plain, practical gate at the end of the ranch road, the land opening up beyond it. She thought about the auction square, the platform, the crowd, $100, and a man who'd done something decent for reasons that were simple and didn't need embellishing. She thought about what it had cost each of them to get from there to here. Not just the obvious costs, the danger and the difficulty, but the smaller ones. Trusting a stranger, being trusted, learning to ask for help without making it mean more than it did. She thought about her father, and about the land under her feet, which was her land now, not because she'd been given it, but because she'd fought for it, and the fighting had been real, and the winning had been imperfect and exhausting, and exactly what winning usually looked like when it wasn't being described by someone who wasn't there. The frontier didn't give you anything. That was the first thing it taught you, and the last thing, and everything in between. It just sat there, vast and indifferent, waiting to see what you were going to do with what you had. She had the land. She had work ahead of her. She had people she trusted and people who trusted her back, which was a rarer thing than anyone liked to admit. She went inside as the dark came in, and she made coffee on her father's stove in her father's kitchen in her own house. And she thought, tomorrow there is fence to assess, and a letter to write to a man named Walt Garfield, and a root cellar to inventory, and probably 40 other things she hadn't thought of yet. She thought, good,